Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Studio One, World Post-Planetary Design, Universal Design. With Ed Keller and Carla Leitao. Are you there? Just to make sure that everybody, yes, awesome. Hi, Carla. Okay, I will do the introduction and I will read the bios of the instructors and then the status on Keller and Carla. So the Research Design Studio World operates as a probe to take stock of the current situation, consider the disequilibrium of multiple systems in spirals, compile an index of research and design possibilities. As architects, urbanists, infrastructural designers, systems thinkers, economists, ecologists, we navigate and negotiate with the intertwined webs of human energy, expenditure, and information flow, and their impacts on civilization and all species on Earth. The challenge is to envision new configurations at the edge of our planetary comfort zone. Architecture's conception of itself as a discipline has depended on centuries on the model of the artificial in relation to the natural, and the primal human action in wilderness, to build a hut or to make a bonfire. This tension between codecs of preservation or rituals of conflagration also configures the very base of organic and planetary life, the negative entropies of design. But our contemporary models of the world might deploy an alternative to the dialectic of conservation of energy or expenditure. What can we call a next nature or a third nature within which all disciplines can operate? In thinking planetary solutions, we cultivate a design approach that embraces dynamic annotation, massive addressability, scripting, and a companion species ship with data. Being able to see with a new kind of perception added by data, while still formulating design ideas generated through the intersection between human input, the automatic, and the autonomous. The problem of the Anthropocene is usually framed by the need to implement the concept of geoengineering. We often hold in our minds that the making of planets has to do with an almost totalitarian restoration of implementation of an ideal equilibrium. Yet on our planet, we face irreversible, future, deep timelines of past and present activity interlaced with complex models of equilibrium. This research studio will support the discovery and invention of interlocked activities in the service of a universalist approach to complete system design. We will identify points of intervention and develop models running the gamut from design buildings to urban interventions, design biology, governance, and new forms of ultimately designed intelligence for world environments yet to come. This research process reflects on new constructions of and for the surface of our planet, from building to city to landscape to ecosystem, reorganizing its architectures and providing new models and structures to navigate flows of energy, information, and culture. We keep in mind as well that subsequent semesters will scale up to the wider design challenges for atmospheres and cosmos. This studio will work closely with the workshop and seminar program ontologies taught by Ezio Blasetti and Daniel Williams. You've probably been already there yesterday. And let me introduce you the two instructors. So Carla and Ed are founders of AUM Studio, AUM, and Space, a Speculative Future, architectural design, curation, theory, scenarios, and interactive media. Residential installation competitions in Europe and US. The Speculative Futures joined the Data and Matter Group Show and the Venice Biennale in 2018. You can find the link on the website of the new center of the studio. So Keller and Leitao have conceived 20 plus international conferences and lecture series. Their work and writing has appeared in Volume, Punctum, Triple Ampersand, Evolo, N, A and U, AD, Metamorphosis, Wired, Metropolis, Assemblance, and Otagono. Keller is a designer, professor, writer, musician, multimedia artist, and independent scholar. From 2012 to 2020, he was the director of the Center for Transformative Media at the New School. He was an associate dean at Parsons from 2010 to 12. From 2009 to 2020, he was an associate professor at Parsons. Previous academic appointments include the Columbia University from 1998 to 2010 as a professor teaching advanced architectural design, graduate studios and seminar, and serving as the acting director of AAD Architectural Design MS program in 2001. In SCI-AR in 2004 to 9, he founded and coordinated the Mediascapes program, and he was a full-time faculty from 2007 to 2009. And RPI, UPenn, Pratt, Parsons, FIU, and Bennington variously between 1996 to 2010. He has spoken on architecture, film, artificial intelligence, technology, and ecology internationally. Recent seminars at the New School in Parsons include Post-Planetary Design, Soundscape, A Designing AI. Carla Leitao is an architect, professor, and a writer. A lecturer at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute School of Architecture from 2010 until now. Leitao's studio and seminar explore the intersection of architecture, urban systems, technology, ubiquitous cultures, and immersive VR at the Polytechnic Crave Lab. At the Crave Lab, Leitao has developed academic work and research around concepts of assemblies and front-end design for control rooms, interactive spaces and education environments, reimagining private, public, and institutional architectural typologies. Leitao is an instructor at Lisbon's local coordinator of CITREP, an international school teaching design research studios and promoting collaborative design events in several countries. Recent seminars, studios, and lecture courses include Biodrome, Architecture in the Age of Epidemics, Landscape of Oblivion, Proto-Room, Inception, Vision, Interface, Environmental History and Theory, Contemporary Design Approaches, and the Architecture of Civic Form. She co-chaired with Ed Keller an ACSA conference panel on addressability in Detroit in 2017 and curated and organized the event Portugal Now, Cornell AAP folio and exhibition of 20 plus Portuguese offices with conferences in Ithaca and New York City in 2007. She lives and works in New York and in Lisbon. And I'm Artemis, and I'm an old student of the New Center. I'm glad to be back. I'm an architect. I'm studying in the MA Situated Practice, and I'm also a teaching assistant in the Bartlett School of Architecture. Glad to be back, and I'm super excited for the seminar. To you, Andy, Carla.
Artemis, thank you so much. Can everybody hear us? Yeah. Thank you so much for that introduction. We want to start by offering our thanks to the New Center generally for supporting the launch of this new program, and to you and Mo and everyone at the New Center for the collegiality. Enthusiasm. I've collaborated in the previous years on conferences with folks at the New Center, starting I think back in 2016. So it's really great to be part of this project in a kind of a more involved way. We also want to thank our collaborators, Ezio Blazzetti and Dana Williams, for being great friends and colleagues and collaborators in joining this project. And we have a number of upcoming guests this year, so we thank them in advance. And we also thank you folks for participating in the course and the project, especially on a Sunday morning. So thank you very, very much. We don't have to introduce ourselves particularly because Artemis gave a pretty in-depth rundown, but I guess I would say for myself, before I was trained as an architect, I was trained as a musician and a composer. And before I was trained as a musician and a composer, I spent a lot of time rock climbing. And before I spent a lot of time rock climbing, I spent a lot of time reading science fiction. And so the science fiction is a kind of a deep, deep, deep thing for me, going back to when I was about 7 or 8 or 9 years old. And it's surfaced in almost everything I've done in the past 15 or 20 years.
Yes, well, for me as well, I guess it's one of our many common points. I've also, from the beginning, when I was very, very young, I read a lot of sci-fi, and I think that came all through the years of basically architecture school that was very technical in Lisbon, and then much less technical when I came to the States and did my master. So I think that's one of the many ones.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I wanted to say hi to everyone today. Ed is going to take over with his lecture, but I wanted to say hi to everyone and to thank you for being interested in this project. And also just, I really looked forward to start working with you in general. It was the enthusiasm that just transpired from your applications was great. I loved looking at the work that you all already bring with you, the lives you have, and what you're doing, what you're thinking. So I really look forward to talking more with you. Thank you very much.
So let me share the screen. Let's see if this comes through. You folks should be seeing the studio. And what we are thinking of doing today is to just go over the logistics of the course, to unpack the syllabus a little bit, schedule collaborations, and what the kind of arc of the year is, and that'll only be 10 or 15 minutes. And then we have an intro lecture, which I think will be about 45 or 50 minutes, on thinking the planetary and the post-planetary. And then we should have an hour to an hour and a half of discussion time today. Let me just recapitulate a little bit the question of Studio One world. We're thinking that the studio operates as a kind of a probe to take stock of the current situation. This is a kind of a general engagement with where we are right now, not in individual disciplines per se, but literally as a planet, and to consider the disequilibrium, as we put it, of multiple systems and spirals, to compile an index of research and design possibilities. So part of what we'll be doing this spring and across the year is in design research mode, compiling an index. And part of what we'll be doing is making design research proposals or summaries or responses to what we've identified as a set of challenges. And as I think Artemis already read from the overview, the challenge is to envision new configurations at the edge of our planetary comfort zone. This quote from Fire and Memory, where Fernandez Galeano quotes Rainer Banham, has been really, really important for us and for me in the past years, because it establishes a kind of a point in relationship to whether architecture could consider itself as a preservative discipline, and indeed any of the disciplines that we pursue, which make and build things in the world, or if we should consider ourselves as playing a role in a kind of a broader informational and energetic system within which destruction and erasure are actually a crucial part of the overall process. You know, architecture's conception of itself as a discipline has depended for centuries on a model of the artificial in relation to the natural. And the question is, when we are in the forest as the primitive human, do we build the hut or do we make the bonfire? The argument that Fernandez Galeano makes in this book is that building the bonfire is as much an architectural act as making the hut. And this is a kind of a hypothesis that I find incredibly provocative and challenging for us as architects, as designers, as makers, but also crucial in the way that Fernandez Galeano cites it in the context of Margalef, of Prigogine and Stengers, of information theory, and as you'll see in the course of the talk today, how we then cite ourselves as builders and makers in a cosmologically scaled set of flows and systems. We can also imagine that our contemporary models of the world today might deploy an alternative to the dialectic of conservation of energy or expenditure. We can name check George Bataille here, and I'll speak very briefly about him later. What we could then call a next nature or a third nature within which all disciplines can operate. And so this is something that we're interested in testing this semester and as we go forward. In terms of method, we would generally follow a design research model, setting up in the first half of the semester lectures and discussions like today. And then in the second half of the semester, collective discussions that are promoted by students' presentations and inquiries. All of you as participants, what you're working on, what you bring to the research, and also what you develop over the course of the 2 months. And then, of course, across the year. So you'll explore development of your ideas and potential projects, producing materials in a range of formats. Of course, this isn't an architecturally discipline-specific project. This is a radically pan and transdisciplinary project. You're welcome to work in groups or individually. And the objective of presentations across the semester will be to create areas of focus that allow for further development of research, discussion, ideas of paths and directions for your projects and your work. Everyone in this group is also going to be able to cross-fertilize and discuss with the programmed ontologies how to code a world workshop and seminar that Ezio and Danielle are running this semester. And that's a place where you can develop specific skill sets that you could then test out in this studio. And yes, perhaps we are just like the researchers heading into the shimmer in Annihilation. In terms of sites and design subjects, we're going to identify points of intervention and develop models that run the gamut from buildings to urban interventions, design biology, governance, new forms of design intelligence for planetary systems, world makings yet to come, and again, repeating the intro that Artemis gave us. So points of intervention would be provisional. You will describe them, you'll map them, you'll plan, and the research process would reflect on new constructions of and for the surface of the planet, from building, city, landscape to ecosystem. Bear in mind, as we've noted, that there's a second model in the summer, atmospheres, ecosystems, soundscapes, and a third session in the fall, which will take on cosmos. So for people who are tracking across the year, that's going to be part of a longer arc across the year. We will work closely with Ezio and Danielle in programmed ontologies. We'll also have guests at the end of the semester, Lydia Calapoliti, Ben Gertzel, Stephanie Wakefield, and Peter Watts. And they'll be part of an overview effect lecture series and symposium that will take place in early June, but some of them will drop in at the end of our semester, which will be, I think, right at the end of May. In addition, something interesting came up as the winter passed. I took on a role as a creative director for the Italian Virtual Pavilion at this Venice Biennale, the one that was postponed from last year. And so in brief, I put together a group of about 13 exhibitors. There are 10 other creative directors coming from the AA, Bartlett, SciArc, Cynthia Davidson from LOG, other people from around the world, Winka Doubledum from UPenn, and each of us has pulled together a team of anywhere from 8 to 14 exhibitors. Those exhibitors will be putting together very small exhibits for the virtual pavilion. The virtual pavilion will have a presence in the physical pavilion at the Biennale. But the interesting aspect of this, which can impact us across this year, there are a couple of parts to it. One, Carla and I are both exhibitors, and the new center is going to be an exhibitor. So various aspects of seminars and work at the new center can be featured across the June, July, August, September, October, November time period. The second thing is the Biennale asked us to put together a running set of programs, all the exhibitors across the year, conferences, panels, symposia, workshops, lecture series, performances, seminars, some free and open to the public, and some with registration fees. And so what we're doing, each of us as exhibitors and the new center and other institutes that I've invited to be part of the exhibitor track, is putting together an enormously ambitious set of conferences, workshops, symposia, lectures, and so forth. This will start at the end of May, and it will run until the middle of November. And there will be multiple opportunities for us to drop in and conduct interventions in a really wide range of ways across the year. So that'll be something that we talk about during the next month. That'll be something that is, as I noted here, TBD, TBC, so to be determined what we'll do and to be confirmed what we can do across the coming months. I'll be very brief in summarizing the syllabus because you all have it, but what we'll do is we'll start with 4 or 5 sessions. That will be the kind of lecture discussion format. Today, I'll do a lecture on why we should think the post-planetary. Next week, we'll have a talk about scale, asking the question, which worlds, at what scales, and for whom. The week after, we'll talk about intelligence, energy, life, thought as not thought. This will try to take on a question, for example, are there universals of intelligence that can be mapped and extrapolated? Something we can take on as designers. The session would introduce a variety of forms of intelligence across different realms, fields, and scales, and we'll discuss their existing and potential role in post-planetary existence and design. The week after, foundations, world-building intelligence, and impermanence. We would say, as our gaze and body moves through space and time, we all are always terraforming and colonizing creatures. And we will look at ways in which deep past histories lay current grounds. We'll inquire how those deep pasts become structure and foundations of productively uncertain futures. So that will be the first 4 or 5 sessions. We'll have wiggle room if we want to include some more lectures going into the second half of the semester. Week 5 would be grounding foundations. We would respond to the foundations lecture and discussion. Week 6, framing and scalar bodies, respond to the scale lecture. And at this point, I think there will be a tremendous amount of dialogue and cross feedback amongst ourselves. Week 7, networking, drive, behavior, and intelligence. And then week 8 would be a kind of a final discussion, most likely with invited guests to talk about what we're doing. In terms of platforms, we'll use Zoom, of course, obviously. We'll use Slack as one coordination channel. And I understand just from speaking to Mo yesterday that the new center will be using Discord a bit more. So we'll be evaluating whether it makes sense for us to fold Discord into this particular semester, depending on how you all feel about it and how you want to use it. And we'll also look at other online platforms, design softwares, et cetera, that everyone is familiar with and needs to use in the course of the work that you do. Just one more logistics point. We had thought to try to convene a meet and greet for everybody before the semester started, and things got too compressed. We didn't get around to that, but we understand that many of you must have done this yesterday in Ezio and Danielle's seminar. And so we're guessing that maybe 80 to 90% of you have already introduced yourselves to each other. And what we'll do is we'll just ask folks to put a very short bio and link on the Slack as we go forward in the next week so that you can become familiarized with each other's work. And I think there'll be already, again, some overlap with many or most of you in Ezio and Danielle's seminar. But that's something we want to get going as quickly as possible. Again, I'm saying Slack because I'm pretty sure that's the platform we're going to use, but it might end up being Discord. We'll have some dialogue with everybody on that. So that's a pretty fast overview of what we'll be doing in the spring. Again, in the summer, we will be running another studio, a mini studio on atmospheres, ecosystems, and soundscapes. And in the fall, our session will be on cosmos, design for the cosmos. And this is all part of a longer arc that Carla and I have put together called Tether, the Archimedean Point, which again looks at world, atmosphere, and cosmos as a kind of a framing for us to understand what it means to think as pan-disciplinary designers today. There will be one conference in the summer on atmospheres, a kind of a symposium, a full-day symposium. The participants to be determined, but Elliot Sharp, the guitarist and composer, will be involved for sure. Hopefully David Rothenberg, hopefully Sandy Ewan, a number of guitarists, composers, and soundscape people that I know from the conferences that I've organized in the past decade. Then in the fall, at the kind of 3/4 point through the new center semester in mid-November, we will hold a major conference on cosmopolitics, and that will be set up to coincide just before the end of the Venice Biennale so that we can take advantage of the relationship that we have with the Biennale. And I have a huge list, and Carla has a huge list of people that we'll be inviting to this event. We'd like to make it we hope, a kind of a defining event around cosmopolitics. Of course, looking back to what Alejandro did a few years ago with the Design Cosmopolitics event they hosted, I think, at Princeton, and the book that they published after that event. And looking very closely at what Isabel Stengers has done in relationship to her work on cosmopolitics, but framing it from our perspective, of course. So that's the arc of the year. It's pretty saturated, I think. I can't believe that we're doing this coming out of the pandemic and still in the pandemic. And a number of those things were absolutely not even in the planning as of a month and a half ago. So this has all come together enormously quickly. And we're tremendously excited about the ability to link our work at the New Center to a lot of these projects, and to link the opportunity with the Biennale to support the studios and seminars at the New Center, and the studios and seminars and conferences we'll be running, and to support your projects also through those collaborations. So very deep breath for 1 second here. Artemis, I just wanted to ask, the question about our time today, are we going to plan for a break around 11:30, or do we just go straight on through?
If you think we're behind because we started late, is as you wish. Like we can see how it goes, and we can have just a couple of minutes for, practical reasons. Okay. So I think this talk will be it'll be less than an hour. I actually, when I'm doing these things, I don't really pay close attention to the chat. So you'll forgive me if someone needs to get my attention, just interrupt me, because I'm not going to be looking at the chat while I'm talking. Okay. So why think the planetary and the post-planetary? I probably should drop a minute or two of back history in here around Carla's work on the planetary and my work on the planetary. Carla has been teaching at Rensselaer for 10 years now, and she's been doing an enormous amount of work in the Crave Lab, which is a surround sound, 128 channel sound system, 6 high-def projector, 15-foot high video wall kind of cave space. And it's a really remarkable environment for her to be teaching architecture studios and seminars, but also it's a place where she's tested out her studios on Oblivion, on planetology, control rooms, and it's a place where we've done some research on soundscapes and musical interface design. In 2013, she taught a studio called Planetology. And in the Planetology studio, what Carla did is she asked the students to think of systems design at a planetary scale and beyond, and to think of architectural design as a form of species design, to think of architecture as a form of living system, if you will. And so the students ended up designing at many different scales, sometimes architecture, sometimes ships, sometimes life support systems, sometimes the humans in their projects evolved tremendously to a kind of a post-human state. In all cases, it was asking the question, at what scale does a species exist, physically and temporally, and how can we think of design across those different scales? In my case, going all the way back to the Mediascapes program I founded at SciArc in 2007, 2008, I've been interested in the problem of planetary infrastructure, urban design, and what it means to think of cities, for example, as living and thinking systems. And so in Mediascapes, those were some questions that we asked. Arriving at Parsons in 2010, I put together the Design and Existential Risk Conference series. And in that, folks like Keller Easterling, Bruce Sterling, David Gersten, Elizabeth Ellsworth, and many others came together to ask, what does it mean to design in the face of existential risk? Of course, we were looking at the Future of Humanity Institute. We were looking at Bostrom's work at the time, Robin Hansen's work. Robin was one of the participants in that lecture series. And for me, that created a kind of catalyst moment where I looked back to the science fiction that I had loved so much when I was a kid. And I realized that there was a very strong trajectory in the very best science fiction. Ursula Le Guin, Ballard, people like that who had really impacted me tremendously as a child, to thinking design at a planetary scale. Because obviously the best science fiction writers have been doing that for decades, and in some cases for a full century. And so that led to the post-planetary design seminar, which I taught for about 7 years at the New School. And in that seminar, we basically asked a range of the questions that we'll be asking in this studio here. What does it mean to think at the post-planetary scale? Now, I'll actually use exactly the same kind of bait and switch reveal that I used in all of those seminars with you folks today. The term post-planetary is a little bit of a misleading term. It isn't really post-planetary. Maybe it could be transplanetary. Maybe it could be
realizing that when we think the post-planetary, we always frame ourselves both on the planet and off the planet simultaneously. And so it's about thinking at multiple scales. It's about thinking about design as always taking place across multiple time scales as a kind of a nexus that binds together, as Michel Serres says, a kind of a bundle that binds together not just different systems, but different times. And that every act of design is a moment where time itself is converted. Linear time is converted into nonlinear time. Nonlinear time is converted back into linear time by design and by life and by the systems that we're all embedded within. So maybe today, and that's the back history, maybe today we could start by asking, what is a world? And again, the questions that I mentioned earlier, whose world is it? At what scale does the world exist? What world are we in? Which world do we want to save or to propagate into the future? What's the aesthetic, what's the ethic of a human confrontation with the non-human? What aesthetics, politics, ethics, and economies, what new modes of individual and collective sovereignty are produced as humanity takes ever larger steps to leave the Earth? How do we work with models not just for human, but myriad systems embedded across each other? How do we model a microbiome, for example, and then apply that model of the microbiome across multiple disciplines? How do we reframe and rotate the position of the human and life in general, complex systems, low entropy systems in general? How can we think through the scenarios that Cixin Liu gives us, Ursula Le Guin gives us, filmmakers, musicians, artists, scientists, beyond the limits of the human? How do we think beyond the limits of gender? We have never been two. We have never been human. We have never been modern. Yes, we have never been human. So how do we cultivate that ability to think at all scales? We could ask a series of questions here that could guide us during the project. So obviously we won't unpack all of these right now, but to mention them just up front here a little bit, what would be natural or artificial intelligence at different scales? What would be life at each scale? What aspect, part, or whole of the human and the inhuman thinks at each scale? What thinks at a millisecond, a microsecond, a second, an hour, a year? Are there universals of intelligence that can be mapped and extrapolated? Can cities and forests, for example, think? Looking at Cohn's work. If so, what kind of intelligence is afforded them and across what timescales? Does a planet have a mind or computational capacity? What might constitute a cosmic commons? What alternate cognitive frameworks might we need to map it? Is there a point of balance between mutual aid and mutually assured destruction? And I'll say this again later, but does anything human make it out of the near future? Thank you, Nick. So let's think about a few themes again today. Worlds, started taking on worlds, scale, intelligence, and foundations. And those will be the, roughly speaking, the lectures that we cover in the next 4 weeks. If we start with worlds, again, to ask those questions, what is a world? How large is a world? Whose world is it? At what scale? And for how long? For how many refrains does it persist? Does it live as a world? My body, in fact, is always elsewhere. It is tied to all the elsewheres of the world. And to tell the truth, it's elsewhere than in the world, because it is around it that things are arranged. It is in relation to it, and in relation to it as if in a relation to a sovereign, that there is a below and above, a right, a left, a forward, and a backward, a near and a far. It is at the heart of the world, this small utopian kernel from which I dream, I speak, I proceed, I imagine, I perceive things in their place. And I negate them also by the indefinite power of the utopias I imagine. My body is like the city of the sun. It has no place, but it is from it that all possible places, real or utopian, emerge and radiate. So that was Foucault 55 years ago. We can leap from the scale of the sun, the planet, back out to the scale of the solar system, down to the scale of an insect. This passage from the second book in Cixin Liu's Dark Forest, three-body problem trilogy, the second book is Dark Forest, is at the very beginning, and an ant is crawling up a monument, a plaque. The ant sensed vibrations in the ground and knew from how they intensified that another giant presence was approaching from somewhere on the ground, a human. Paying it no mind, the ant continued its climb up the formation. At the right angle where the foot of the formation met the ground, there was a spider web. This the ant knew. It carefully detoured around the sticky hanging strands, passing by the spider lying in wait, its legs extended to feel for vibrations in the threads. Each knew of the other's presence, but as it had been for eons, there was no communication. Now, in the trilogy by Cixin Liu, the little snapshot image we have of the ant and the spider is a mesa and a beam of the very broad relationship between the humans and the aliens that are coming to invade planet Earth. Also, humans to humans, also humans to ecosystem, because Silent Spring by Rachel Carson is a huge, an important reference in the first book of the trilogy. So what's the world here? Is it the world of the ant, the world of the spider, the world of the monument, the world of the humans? At the foot of the formation, the spider that Logi had swept aside with the flowers was beginning to reconstruct its web. It drew a glistening strand from the rock face and swung itself like a pendulum to the ground. 3 more swings and the skeleton of the web was complete. 10,000 times the web could be destroyed, and 10,000 times the spider would rebuild it. There was neither annoyance nor despair nor any delight, just as it had been for 1 billion years. So where's the limit of the world? What are the intersections between worlds? And where's the communication? The spider doesn't communicate with the ant, but you could say that when the spider eats the ant, that's a form of communication, not a particularly bandwidth-rich communication for either the ant or the spider, but certainly for the digestion system of the spider, it's a pretty information-rich communication. So how can we reframe ecology as a general model? We'll look at Bataille for a second in a few minutes, but Bataille's general economy, can we frame a general ecology to include supposedly non-living systems, material systems, cultural forms, silver growing as a crystalline structure, the Book of Kells, religious ornamentation? As Phocion says in The Life of Forms in Art, which is where he references the Book of Kells, Baroque forms live with a passionate intensity, a life that's entirely their own. And Phocion is talking about Baroque forms, human Baroque forms, ornamentation, art, design. They proliferate like some vegetable monstrosity. They break apart even as they grow. They tend to invade space in every direction, to perforate it, to become one with all its possibilities. So where's the end of the living system? Is Phocion just using it metaphorically? No. It's a model. It's not a metaphor. How can we extend this to the life world of objects, of systems, of economies, organisms, and ecosystems, thus intertwined? So perhaps in the simplest sense, we'd look at the feedback loops that are present between nature and artifice, highlight their interdependence, if not their inseparability. This image, which I've used dozens of times now, by Chris Jordan, looking at an albatross or a seagull that has died because it ate the plastic, even ate a Bic lighter, shows that the designer of the plastic cap, the designer of the lighter, did not take into account all of the systems that those objects were intertwined with. The idea that design is an act of futuring from Tony Fry implies that the plastic cap futured, and when it futured its way into the ocean, and it futured its way into the albatross's stomach. And so even though the designer never thought a bird was going to eat that plastic cap, nonetheless, the designer designed a plastic cap that could be eaten by a bird. So it's a power to affect and a power to be affected in the Deleuzian Spinozist sense. Every object has a range of possible futures, a range of possible powers to affect and possible powers to be affected. And so this is how we have to think of systems. That's pessimistic. Let's look at birds in an optimistic sense and the intertwining of landscapes and systems. I'll read a brief passage from Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. The geese of the world, each March, they stake their lives on an essential truth. In the beginning, there was only the unity of the ice sheet. Then followed the unity of the March thaw and the northward hejira of the international geese. Every March since the Pleistocene, the geese have honked unity from China Sea to Siberian steppe, from Euphrates to Volga, from Nile to Murmansk, from Lincolnshire to Spitsbergen. Every March since the Pleistocene, the geese have honked unity from Currituck to Labrador, Matamuskie to Ungave, Horseshoe Lake to Hudson's Bay, Avery Island to Baffinland, Panhandle to Mackenzie, Sacramento to Yukon. By this international commerce of geese, the waste corn of Illinois is carried through the clouds to the Arctic tundras, there to combine with the waste sunlight of a nightless June to grow goslings for all the lands between. And in this annual barter of food for light and winter warmth for summer solitude, the whole continent receives as net profit a wild poem dropped from the murky skies upon the muds of March. So I love to read that passage over and over and think about Michel Serres' idea of the conversion of time. The organism is a temporal converter, fixed upon a bouquet of times. The goose brings the corn as energy from the central plains of the United States all the way to the Siberian tundra and breeds there in the summer and converts with its cries of joy as it flies thousands of miles, the energy that it acquired eating the corn into new geese that then fly back and do the same thing over again. So let's think again about this idea of worlds in the context of scale. What fabricates worlds within worlds? What could be a universal model of worlds? Mark Tanzi's Triumph Over Mastery painting shows us the fall of empire. And usually I read, Shelley's Ozymandias here. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Which world fell here? If you think of Piranesi's drawings of Rome, what are they indexing? What are they capturing in that moment when Rome only had a few thousand people living in it as opposed to 1 million? How can we think of each of the artifacts that we leave, that we put into the world, these compression, decompression structures that capture a current existence, a previous existence in architectural form or design or infrastructure or cultural form and project it into the future? How can we imagine our role in a cosmologically scaled system? As Bataille says, man is only a roundabout subsidiary response to the problem of growth. We are just one agent among countless agents embedded in energy and information flow. Doubtless through labor and technique, he's made possible an extension of growth beyond the given limits. But just as the herbivore relative to the plant, the cow eating grass, and the carnivore relative to the herbivore, the tiger eating the cow, is a luxury, man is the most suited of all living beings to consume intensely, sumptuously, the excess energy offered up by the pressure of life to conflagrations, befitting the solar origins of its movement. So here we have a nice link back to Fernandez Galeano's Fire and Memory, although interestingly, Fernandez Galeano does not footnote Georges Bataille anywhere in the book. So again, how do we situate organic life, human life, non-organic, complex, low entropy systems, the crystal, the Book of Kells, cultural systems? How do we situate them in a much broader time frame? J.G. Ballard gives us some beautiful clues here from the drowned world. These are the oldest memories on Earth, the time codes carried in every chromosome and gene. Every step we've taken in our evolution is a milestone, inscribed with organic memories, from the enzymes controlling the carbon dioxide cycle to the organization of the brachial plexus and the nerve pathways of the pyramid cells in the midbrain. Each is a record of 1,000 decisions millions of years ago, taken in the face of a sudden physical-chemical crisis. Evolution embeds a memory in the organism, and that memory propagates forward. I don't mean a conscious memory in each of our minds. I mean, and Ballard means, a memory which is a molecularly scaled, a cellularly scaled decision, which allows that organism to survive. He goes on to say, the brief span of an individual life is misleading. Each one of us is as old as the entire biological kingdom, and our bloodstreams are tributaries of the great sea of its total memory. The uterine odyssey of the growing fetus recapitulates the entire evolutionary past, and its central nervous system is a coded timescale, each nexus of neurons and each spinal level marking a symbolic station, a unit of neuronic time. So Ballard is making this argument that we as living systems are not just the moment now. We are actually in a fantastic way co-present with hundreds of thousands, millions of years of our past, each of those marked with, as he puts it, 1,000 physicochemical crises that then become decisions, that then become embedded in our heritage, in our organisms. So how can we identify continuity across scales of mechanisms? How can we jump from the biological, the evolutionary, to, again, the cultural, the social, and the technological? How can we fold the mediascape and the technoscape into the bioscape? How can we identify the foundations of our many intersecting worlds and change the way we're able to think ourselves in relationship to the world in relation to these foundations? Artaud tried to do this in Theater and Its Double in his work, saying if music affects snakes, it's not on account of the spiritual notions it offers them. Snakes have no idea what the cultural content of music is, but because snakes are long and coil their length upon the earth, because their bodies touch the earth at almost every point, and because the musical vibrations affect them like a very subtle, very long massage. That's precisely what Speer and what the Nazi Party did in the 30s when they built the Nuremberg rally site, when propaganda met spectacle, met theater, met early cinema, and all folded together to create that subtle, very long massage that bound together hundreds of thousands, millions of people, very specific technical moves on the part of human designers to create a event space, a spectacle that would do what Artaud was talking about. But Artaud was interested not in binding people together in a fascist way, but Artaud was interested in exploding people's affect, open to potentiality. That's clearly not what the Speer Nuremberg rally site was interested in doing. So how can we go beyond that? Cixin Liu talks about this in the very first page of the three-body problem, looking at the history of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. During the battles like this one raged across Beijing like a multitude of CPUs working in parallel. Their combined output, the Cultural Revolution. The tragedy of the Cultural Revolution. In science fiction, in Ghost in the Shell 2, Oshi's brilliant film, which we should watch over the next week if you haven't seen it. I'm not going to show a clip, just show this still. This is a data haven in the film, an entire city, which is just a data haven. We can think from biologies to ecosystems to technologies to cultures to architecture to cities to mediascapes. They're all rich, low entropy systems in the planetary stack, to use Benjamin Bratton's term. So I'll read you a quote from this film. This area was once intended as the Far East's most important information center, a special economic zone in its heyday. These towers survive as a shadow of the city's former glory. Its dubious sovereignty has made it the ideal haven for multinationals and the criminal elements that feed off their spoils. It's a lawless zone beyond the reach of the UN or e-police. Reminds me of the line, what the body creates is as much an expression of DNA as the body itself. But the same applies to beaver dams and spider webs. I'll take the coral reefs as my metaphor, though hardly so beautiful. If the essence of life is information carried in DNA, then society and civilization are just colossal memory systems. And a metropolis like this one, simply a sprawling external memory, How great is the sum of thy thoughts? If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. Psalms 139, Old Testament. The way you spout these spontaneous exotic references, I'd say your own external memory is pretty twisted. You're one to talk. His legions, angel forms who lay entranced, thick as autumnal leaves that strow the brooks. Now you're quoting Milton, but we're not Satan. So how can we think of this from an optimistic point of view again? Let's look at Venice. Let's think of Venice through the point of view of Ruskin in Stones of Venice. And I've used this quote like 100 times at this point, so apologies to anyone who's heard me use this passage before. Ruskin in Stones of Venice compares cultural flows across 500, 700, 1,000 years to glaciers and streams of lava, and says, the glacier stream of the Lombards and the following one of the Normans left their erratic blocks wherever they had flowed. But the lava stream of the Arab, even after it ceased to flow, warmed the whole of the northern air. And the history of Gothic architecture is the history of the refinement and spiritualization of northern work under its influence. So what is Ruskin saying here? Ruskin, again, like Phocion, is not giving us an easy metaphor. Ruskin is essentially saying, those cultural flows, those migrations of people across hundreds of years, moved like glaciers or flows of lava. And when we look at the architectural form and the urban forms that they left behind as evidence of their passing, we have to imagine those forms as the byproducts of flows which literally moved like glaciers and like lava and left behind their erratic blocks. Yeah, so we have to look beyond the symbolic form of the cultural structures to see them as symptomatic or evidential of some other much more slow-moving, much more powerful systems. How can we make a jump to natural systems again? Our planet itself is indexically thinking. Material systems bundle together different temporalities. The Earth has registers of what we could call massive addressability in the river meanders across hundreds of thousands or millions of years. We asked earlier, does a planet think? Does a planet have a mind or computational capacity? And if so, what kinds of information processing takes place? What networks are imbricated, folded into those processes? And how can we work as designers to access those flows of information and that energy? Systems, cybernetics. How can we think of networks as intelligence? How can we think of geology as computation? So these drawings of the Mississippi River meanders, which I'm assuming many of you have seen, are remarkable in the way that they reveal indexically over hundreds of years, thousands of years, the river's different pathways. The river literally meanders. There's a basin that the river sits in geologically. It's a very wide basin. And the river follows one path, and then erosion allows that curve to be cut off and turned into an oxbow. And then that oxbow becomes only a little bit of a pond, and then it becomes a deeply sedimented marsh, and then it becomes very rich farmland, which humans discover 10,000, 100,000 years later. Those meanders all take place within the basin of attraction. And so, if you want to think of this from another perspective, if you want to think of the term basins of attraction from a dynamic systems perspective, then you see a literal physical analog in the way that the river basin forms a basin of attraction for the flow of water. What's a characteristic feature of life? Schrödinger says this. When is a piece of matter said to be alive? When it goes on doing something, exchanging material with its environment and so forth, and that for a much longer period of time than we would expect an inanimate piece of matter to keep going under similar circumstances. Well, if you speed up the flows of air up and down a mountain next to an ocean, looking at the anabatic and katabatic flows, days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, at what point does it go from being just the flow of hot air and cool air to being something that's actually so information rich that we would say it's alive? Perhaps we can look for a reimagined concept of the anabasis and the catabasis, the upstream and downstream journey in Apocalypse Now, which stitches together pure myth and archetype across the geopolitics of the Vietnam War. It's a kind of lens, this film, for scrying a different flow of time and identity. Anabasis, the inland journey, the upstream journey, referencing Xenophon. Anabasis, referencing the flows of air, the change of temperature, the circuits, the systems. Anabasis, an upstream journey, which leaps off planet as we set the controls for the heart of the sun. And we head straight for George Bataille's dream, for George Bataille's nightmare. Someone, was it Tony Negri or was it Frederick Jameson, said that at a certain point, George Bataille's disregard for the human renders his thought useless to us. But I disagree. Among other obsessions, Bataille was attempting to think a general economy, and I would extend that to a general ecology, yes? And that, it's clear, is what we need. We need a truly open model of a general economy and ecology for the planetary, the extraplanetary, which assists us in recognizing our current state, situating ourselves across scales. It gives us a model of expenditure which smoothly integrates across all models of economy, monetary, political, cultural, energetic, material, all together. So human ideas and uses of economy are understood as a part, a subset, not a center. Our concept of capital. What is capital? Is capital a human concept, a human ethics? No. Capital is a natural system. Humans simply forked it. We forked natural functions of capital into our local forms of operation. And so perhaps this is a Copernican term for economic and ecologic models. But, you know, there's quite a ways to go, as CCRU and Nick Land said a while back, and I've already said this earlier today, nothing human makes it out of the near future. So Kubrick's vision of the Star Child is not really human anymore. It's optimistic. The generous alien upgrade and the Star Child's contemplating Earth. And if you read 2001, the Arthur C. Clarke novel, you realize that at the very end of 2001, the humans launch a nuclear attack on the Star Child, and the Star Child simply stops them. Maybe there is some future in our dreaming. But our future after a failed grasp at general economies, I was optimistic there for a second, after a failed grasp at general economies might also look more like this vision. Melancholic, stuck in a place where, to misuse a line from Tom Waits, no one speaks English and everything is broken. So I would argue here that we're already vastly more complex and extended and weird in a beautiful way. And for now, for us today, thinking the planetary and the post-planetary as designers, in our near future, getting through the Cambrian explosion of mind and technology that Werner Vinge forecasts will take place in the next 40 years, or maybe we're already 10 years or 20 years through it. This will require us to acknowledge and recognize all of these embedded systems, to recognize and acknowledge all these very weird, beautiful parts. So we must remember the vast anabasis that lies behind us and that lies ahead of us to help us identify and escape the great filter. Let's look back in time. Let's look out and forward in time. So talk briefly about intelligence here, linking it again to energy, information, and indeed to empathy. And I'll make a kind of a very brief linkage here to a kind of gestural cosmopolitics. Empathy and translation could be catalysts for a universal general economy, ecology, and politics. We could propose a model of intelligence that's framed again in this universal context of energy and information flow. When I say empathy, I don't mean it in a simple human way, but I'll drop a footnote there. We'll think about empathy across the next weeks in a radically non-human way that would be constructed by the possibility of translation, but not a normal human translation, not a normal human communication. Excuse me. If we use Michael Whitmore's concept of massive addressability, text as a massively addressable body, we might ask, what are the limits of life and mind? What are the limits of any system when it's addressable by other systems? What are the mechanisms that allow that addressability? Well, a chemical exchange is an addressability. You and I speaking is an addressability. Using Google to do a search on all of Shakespeare's work would be an addressability, etc. This image, which visually represents the action of a neural network, looks like life, or the outlines of a form of life. But are the neural pathways indexed to your proto-ecologies of mind, or are they just semi-animate crystalline forms? Again, I think of Werner Vinge's argument that the singularity will be like the Cambrian explosion, but it will be of forms of mind and life, forms of mind, and only in 40 years instead of tens of millions of years. So maybe borrowing from Spinoza and Foucault again, we could say that any given nature can be defined by the ensemble of systems and organisms that it's dangerous to, that it can be affected by, and that it can affect. The collected points of view, or the cumulative knowledge that's shared by all agents in a given ensemble, allow us a definition of what the useful scope of the agency is of that ensemble. So I'm thinking about general economies, general ecologies, general intelligence here. A single human, for example, would be like a galaxy to the viruses that live in us. Their point of view, if it could be combined with ours, would yield a composite nature, a thalience, to use Carl Schroeder's terminology. It would not only yield a composite nature, but a composite temporality, because what time does a virus live in? A very different time than we live in. What time does a virus think in? Again, a very different time than we think in. So we could ask also, is intelligence the end result of 100% transmission of information, like 100% sent, 100% received, understood, lossless? Or is intelligence the result of a partially failed transmission? This is the concept that Agamben gives us in Means Without End, Notes on the Gesture. Agamben says, the gesture opens the sphere of ethos as that more proper sphere of that which is human and is communication of communicability. So Agamben is essentially making the argument here, communication is not me successfully communicating to you what I'm thinking. This gesture of communication, if it's successful, at least in this framework, which is my interpretation of Agamben, perhaps Agamben would disagree with me, is me communicating something to you and you receiving something, but not everything that I'm trying to communicate. And that is a gesture, communicating communicability, communicating an intent to communicate. Again, with all due respect to Agamben, I would say that we should revise this and say that it's not the human that we permeate. It's not that the human, the ethos is a more proper sphere of that which is human, but it is the ethos of the more proper sphere of that which is a low entropy intelligence, a sapience, and that the gesture is most suited to. Humans are a subset of that category. Venice, perhaps, is a thinking system, a living system, the totality of Venice across a millennia. And the gesture is more appropriate from an ethical point of view, and even a moral point of view, to the city of Venice than to the human individual in the city of Venice. And implicit in this would be feedback loops at many different scales and coordination. So again, we're talking about intelligence here in the broader framework of what is a world, what is a construction of a world, what are scales of systems. Feedback loops lead to coordination, but to what end? Again, we could say that complex systems, whether they're biological, you and I, or non-organic, are all part of a flattened ontological continuum. And an unavoidable, for me, techno-political question that's precipitated by this, by the algorithmic imbrications of life itself across all these different scales, is taken up by Robin Hanson in his Rapacious Hardscrabble Frontier text, where he discusses the deep time of galactic travel. Actually, that's what this text is about. He says, the familiar biological world contains only local coordination. Well, Ballard has already kind of slightly contradicted that in the quote that I gave you a half an hour ago, the idea of the individual life being a kind of an illusion that we're really all part of this millennia, millions of years long continuity. But anyway, back to Hanson. Hanson says, genes can coordinate within a body, and creatures can coordinate within a tribe, but on larger scales, genes, creatures, and tribes compete for scarce resources with little coordination. We humans today coordinate our actions via markets and governments, but even we do not have a strong planetary government. Will our descendants coordinate more than we do? Is coordination a good thing? Is coordination and communication a healthy thing? Is the gesture something that always leads to communication and co-species life, or does it lead to something else? This model of intelligence that we're talking about, non-human, not purely informational, it explores specific structures of consciousness or communicative systems leading to increased agency and awareness. But increased agency and awareness doesn't necessarily mean that a human is still a human and still alive in the way that we used to think that a human being alive is. In the image from Vandermeer's trilogy and the film adaptation by Garland, Annihilation, we see this horrible, terrifying image, which the women exploring the shimmer, this zone, can't understand. It looks like a person's been killed by a giant slime mold, exploded open. But the more we spend time in the shimmer, the more we realize that there are potential refractions, permutations, extrapolations of human life across vegetal life, across other species, those species across us. And that might actually be what the shimmer does. It doesn't destroy us. It exfoliates us out across multiple timescales. And this, of course, I'm thinking a little bit of David Rodin's remarkable work on the post-human. This results in a kind of a possible post or trans or pan species ethics. And it would underscore that which is both human and non-human simultaneously, that which is both living, according to the way we usually define life, and non-living simultaneously, that which lives both in human timescales and geological and cosmological timescales. And this could point towards a kind of a model of universal cognition, universal systems, universal sentience, sapience, and thalience, to again use Carl Schroeder's term. So this has been a very, very dense talk, and I'm going to wrap up in just the next few minutes. I want to conclude with a concept from Nandita Biswas-Malamphy's essay on Dune, the novel by Frank Herbert, which we circulated an excerpt from to you folks a few days ago. There are many ways to frame the broadest arc of this set of problems. What is a world? What's the limit and scale of a world? What is intelligence? What are general ecologies, general economies? What are foundations that we can perceive and understand? What's intelligence? For me, Cixin Liu's trilogy was a real watershed moment. And in my attempts to respond to the frames that Cixin Liu's trilogy gives us, I've adopted the concept of a cosmopolitical gesture. It's an information-rich but untranslatable, or at least partly untranslatable act as a counterpart to this. And Nandita's reading of Dune is useful in the way that she cites the gesture in both an abstract space, but also an energetic and ecological landscape, very much as Herbert's original novel also constructs an interstellar politics, which is based on the connections between non-human species, planetary hallucinogens, literally, and the life and death drive of systems, species, planets, and generally all of this within their neurophysiological constraints. So Nandita says gestural ecology is best understood in the context of a predator-prey ecology that's engineered to track, trap, and hook across given expanses. Hooks happen to be the very technical device that permit humans to interact directly with the underground spice-producing sandworms, but she's using that also as a kind of a general model. The hook is a technical device that permits one system to interact directly with another system that's very different in nature, very different in scale. So the gestural framework of ecological notation, and I've paired it with the drawings of the river meander here, the hook-like mechanism is what enables the science to track, localize, translate, decompose components, and identify and manipulate mechanisms of activity and transcribe movement across landscapes. So here we have a theoretical model, a very pragmatic model, a very precise technical unpacking of how a hook works in relationship to how you would hook an animal, a fictional animal, but nonetheless, how you would literally hook the animal, how you would then turn that into tracking, mapping, translation, and transcription. So these are all design operations. Now, they don't have to take place at a planetary scale or a post-planetary scale, but in Dune, they certainly do. In Nandita's work, they do. In many of the projects I think we'll take on this year, they probably will. But they don't have to. They can be perfectly well used in the design of a building, the design of a city, the design of a local system, the design of an interface, the design of an object, an artifact, etc. So in world building, we acknowledge that any active design, design thinking, or design practice is tentatively or willfully oblivious, productively ignorant, and actively relearning the foundations that will ground it. What are the grounds we step foot on? What are they made of? This very beautiful video by Mark Pritchard, worth seeing if you haven't seen it. Have a look after the talk today. So again, this is also to return to the concept of anabasis and universal systems models. We can ask, how do we cite our practice in this seemingly almost unnavigably vast landscape from the subatomic all the way up to the cosmological? And Freeman Dyson, the renowned physicist, mathematician, researcher, thinker, developer of interstellar star systems, Freeman Dyson gives us a really, I think, important insight into this. Dyson says, in the real worlds of astronomy and biology, ordered structures emerge spontaneously from disorder. Basically, in the real world, we get order out of disorder. How does that happen? Because the laws of thermodynamics would say that we live in a really open system which is dissipating out order, and that over billions of years, everything is going to get very, very cold and everything's going to die. And locally, energy flows out to an average, and order flows out to an average. And life struggles against that. Life is to use Schrodinger's concept from what is life is a negative entropy system. But Dyson is saying in the real world, in biology, ordered structures emerge spontaneously from disorder. How does this happen? The solar system emerged from a disordered cloud of gas and dust. The fearful symmetry of the tiger and the beauty of the peacock emerged from a dead and disordered planet. How does this happen? Because any object whose motions are dominated by gravity will have energy decreasing as temperature increases and energy increasing as temperature decreases. So Dyson is basically saying, look, we got to talk about thermodynamics in relationship to gravity and what gravity does. Gravity making planets, gravity making suns, making black holes, gravity making a gradient of gravity across hundreds of thousands of light years from a galactic center out into deep space where there's nothing. Flat space-time. So in every situation where gravity is dominant, he says, the second law causes local contrasts to increase together with entropy. This is true for astronomical objects like the sun, also for large terrestrial objects such as thunderstorms and hurricanes. The diversity of astronomical and terrestrial objects, including living creatures, tends to increase with time in spite of the second law of thermodynamics. If this doesn't totally gel for you, take a few weeks to think about this one, because when I read this article, this was in a review that he made of one of Jeffrey West's books. Jeffrey West is a researcher at the Santa Fe Institute. It really blew my mind, this particular passage, because it suddenly made everything hang together in relationship to how life effectively functions and where we would situate ourselves, how we would comprehend our positioning on multiple scales across the flows of energy and the flows of information. So again, anabasis. Xenophon's anabasis is about an army which has to journey inland, upriver, to survive. Anabasis and catabasis are about flows of energy as the sun rises and heats things up and winds flow up, and then the sun sets and things cool down and the wind flows back down. But anabasis and catabasis are also about upstream and downstream flows against the flow, movements against the flow. Apocalypse Now is a movement upriver to a place where a mad soldier king has lost their mind. Anabasis, a movement upriver to a place where mind has been transformed radically to the inhuman, to the feral, the savage, the amoral, the immoral, the unethical. And so ultimately, we're interested in a relationship between models of energy flow, event, and mind, connecting them back to material and biological systems. And we ask in a very open way, can bios and zoe, human, non-human, inorganic systems, life and inorganic life as a network of cohabitations, be understood through relations we seek, invoke, or implement between forms of life. Create an ever-growing taxonomy of species of thought and species of being, a general economy of modes of mind and of being, a cosmopolitics. So again, what is post-planetary and universal thinking? This is one argument we could make for it, to say it is a universal system grounded in science to comprehend what the evidentiary nature of our cultural production and ourselves as living systems are in a literally cosmologically scaled set of flows and relations. I'll make a closing comment on coordination here, and I think I actually have done this in less than an hour, so that's good. So a closing comment on coordination, again, using this image squeezed from Arrival. Our existing concepts and tools of coordination and our planet's tools of coordination across billions of years give way now, today, technologically, for us, to new forms of technologically mediated and produced coordination. And this, I would say, is the unique design challenge that we face today as humans on our planet. The speeds and the bifurcations, the capillary speciations of connection that we see today present us with a challenge that seems almost insurmountable as we turn into the strong wind of the century that we are 1/5 of the way into now. And ultimately, again, all of the questions that I've tried to lay out for you today reconfigure our relation to human and non-human modes of intelligence, ethics, and ontology. For me personally, the concept of the gesture as an information-rich but untranslatable act of communication returns always more powerfully, but it doesn't lead towards many recognizable forms of the human. Now, I've drawn the idea of coordination in part from science fiction, in part from scientists and mathematicians like Dyson, but it's just as applicable to the frameworks of emerging AI, AGI, and ASI. And many people that I'm interested in think that the problem of communicating with AI is roughly equivalent to the problem of communicating with aliens. And Stephen Wolfram has written about this quite beautifully in a couple of essays that we'll send to you. It's also applicable to the biopolitics of attentional capture that we live in today as a technologically framed planet. Attentional capture. Think back to that image of the Nuremberg rally site designed by Speer that I showed you, paired with a quote from Antonin Artaud. Those people knew how to engineer spectacle such that it would capture the attention of millions of people and bind them together in a singular form of thought, a singular form of affect. That was in 1933, almost a century ago. Amazing. So we live now in a technological scape, a technoscape, where attentional capture is tuned to the fraction of a second. How do we reposition ourselves as designers of systems, as designers of communication, to take on those challenges? Perhaps gesture may be the only true mode of translation and communication we've ever had, the only mode that we can have. I'll finish with two quotes. One from St-Jean Peirce's Anabasis. I'll read the English quote by T.S. Eliot. If you read French, I highly urge you to read the French original. I have halted my horse by the tree of the doves. I whistle in notes so sweet, shall the rivers break faith with their banks. Living leaves in the morning fashioned in glory. Now, this poem is a poem about the founding of a city. It's about the founding of cultures. It's about the journey upriver and inland. But it's also a kind of a universalist meditation on energy flow. And I'll read you a quote from the third book by Cixin Liu. And the image that you see here is a closed world. Inside this glass sphere, there's some water, a little bit of air, and some algae, and there's a little shrimp in there, or two little shrimps. I don't remember how many there were when I took this picture. I think they start off with two shrimps maybe, or maybe it's just one, so they don't reproduce and overwhelm the closed world cycles. The message in a bottle and the ecological sphere were the only things left in the mini universe. The bottle faded into the darkness, so in this 1 cubic kilometer universe, only the little sun inside the ecological sphere gave off any light. In this minuscule world of life, a few clear, watery spheres drifted serenely in weightlessness. One tiny fish leapt out of a watery sphere and entered another, where it effortlessly swam between the green algae. On a blade of grass on one of the miniature continents, a drop of dew took off from the tip of the grass blade, rose spiraling into the air, and refracted a clear ray of sunlight into space. So that is a really marathon sprint across some of the themes that we want to take on this spring and across the year. And we tried to fold stuff from atmosphere and cosmos into this talk, obviously. But looking at a world, we think that it's looking at foundation, it's looking at atmosphere, it's looking at cosmos all the time, simultaneously. And we hope that this is a kind of an interesting and provocative jumping off point, an intersection point with your own work, a kind of a catalyst for discussion, a catalyst for more work. So thank you so much for bearing with me on that maybe kind of marathon and saturated journey. That's the talk for today. And I think we had tentatively scheduled a 5-minute break here. So if people want to take a 5-minute break, we can do that. Or if you want to just dive straight into a conversation, we can do that as well.
How do you all feel?
A break would be nice.
Yeah. Let's take a 5-minute break. See you at 7-minute break. See you at 11:35 Eastern Time.
Okay, I think we're all back. Just checking the Q&A from the attendees. And I think Ed is typing something there. Okay. He texted me that his connection was cut. In the meantime, you can write down some ideas you want to be discussed. I think we should wait for them to come back. Super inspiring presentation. Welcome back.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I had to restart everything here. Don't know what happened. But. So I was just in the process of answering a comment that someone made about
Yes.
Freeman Dyson and Jeffrey West, and then Zoom crashed on me and my network went down. So I was going to say the Dyson. I don't remember who asked that question, but the Dyson came from a book review that he wrote on Jeffrey West's book about 3 or 4 years ago, and I have a PDF of that which I can share with you. I think it's on the New York Review of Books, but I don't remember for sure, and it's behind a paywall, but I have a PDF I'll send to you. And basically, Dyson is kind of gently disagreeing with West's entire model, because he's saying that West doesn't take into account gravity in relationship to thermodynamics and nonlinearly scaling systems, because West looks at cities and is like, cities are these nonlinearly scaling systems. They're not like elephants. Like, you can only get an elephant so big and then the whole system just like falls apart. But cities, West argues, you can keep scaling and they keep getting faster and more energy intense. And so Dyson's basically like, well, you need to look at the work of some of these other people, because if West, you cited your work in the context of gravity thermodynamics as opposed to the way that you're citing it, you'd have some other insights. So that's, I'll send that article to you, to everybody. I'll put it in the Google Drive. Yeah. But anyway, I also saw someone saying like, "Whoa, that was a trip." I lost the entire chat. I don't have any of my chat left here, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
I can read them out if you, yeah, because you restarted, so you probably don't see it. Let me go from the beginning. You started answering some.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone in the beginning, someone mentioned Manuel de Landa. Of course, he said that there's a connection and it's an influence of yours and Carla's.
Yep.
Poetically, the inhuman wells, yes. That's recording, of course. Sorry, there are some practical comments here. Nazrim says, say unpacks very well how planetary design can easily be a shot in the foot. This is Felipe. I got the sense that you wanted to show us beforehand what we are not going to do. Is that the correct version? Felipe, you can jump in and talk for yourself.
Yeah, everybody should definitely chime in. I mean, that's a funny question. You know, it's really, it's up to you what you're going to do. I assume some people are coming from a context where they're actually deeply embedded in ongoing projects, and this is going to be a kind of like, you know, test bed where you can like bounce ideas off of me and Carla and the people we bring in and get feedback, and we'll be like Studio Crit environment for work that you're already doing, which is great. I'm really not sure what you shouldn't do in a kind of context like this, because part of it as a design research project is for you to identify what you think is urgent and valuable to take on. And the post-planetary universal framework model or meta framework that we offer is provocation. Clearly, both Carla and I are pretty deeply embedded in and invested in it, but it's not something that I think we would say is the only way to approach the world or the only way to do design. Not at all. It's not, this is not we've had the insight and this is really the way that everybody has to work. It's not like that at all. And we're also synthesists. I mean, I'll speak for myself. I'm really an expert generalist, and I feel guilty in sort of thinking that I got that concept from Rem Koolhaas years ago, but I don't remember. But that's what I would call myself, an expert generalist, in the sense that I can make connections across different disciplines that maybe oftentimes or maybe only sometimes people don't make. I'm a synthesist in the sense that Peter Watts talks about his character in Blindsight, his main character being a synthesist. I try to rotate multidimensional problem specifications down into simple dimensional spaces where they can be diagrammed and abstracted and then operated with, not necessarily properly translated, but turned into operational form. And so that's the way I would present myself as a consultant to you all. I can give feedback in that sense, and I certainly have a lot of experience doing that, and I love doing that. But there's no single path through this semester or this year. Certainly you could develop a range of manifestos and projects, case studies, or proposals that would be different from the ones that I or Carla would focus in on, and that's fine. It's a very open process. I know some people who I won't name, but some people run design studios in the architecture framework using very precise methodologies, and I always envied them, because many of the projects, if you were not from inside that culture, they would all look the same. And you'd be like, wait a minute, every student project in this studio is identical. But then if you were inside that kind of process, you'd see, it's like listening to one Steve Reich piece or another Steve Reich piece of music. You're like, geez, this all sounds the same. No, it doesn't. When you get inside it, you can see these incredible like tectonic and systemic differences from project to project, but you have to be inside it. The reason I always envied those design studios is the critics specified exactly what the students would do from the very first day of the studio, and everyone did that. And so it simplified the critic's life tremendously, from my perspective anyway, because, the students all did the exact same thing. I never have taught studios like that. And Carla has, I think, never or almost never taught studios like that. We're extremely open to people bringing entire conceptual and positional frameworks in and working on them. And then we find ways of having a dialogue. So there's no specific one working methodology in this project. Hopefully that answers the kind of question that someone had.
Hey, Ed, sorry, I made that question. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. I wasn't making the question as a student in this program, because I'm not in this program. I'm in the critical philosophy program, so I don't have a project. Well, I do have a project, but not for this program. But you replied to a lot of other questions that one could pose regarding this. Like, for example, what do non-designers have to do in this seminar? Is one of them. How can we contribute to this seminar? Is one of the questions that.
Oh, as someone who's not necessarily a designer, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are a number of answers to that. Thank you. That's a really interesting point. I think Carl and I probably would answer in similar ways. First, what you do is an act of encounter with the world and response, and that's an act of design. So without sounding too wishy-washy or, like, oh, every voice matters, your approach is an act of design. And so if you do a form of philosophy, then you would look for analogous, Reza insists this philosophy's design process. Yes, I mean, well, that makes sense. Some of you may or may not know this, but with Eugene Thacker and Nicola Maschindero, back in 2011, I convened a conference on Cyclonopedia. And I had read Cyclonopedia in depth and loved it, fell madly in love with it, in fact, and found it one of the best and funniest things I'd ever read. So it was really great to ultimately finally connect with Reza a few years later after that. But anyway, to return, Felipe, to your point, another way of approaching this would be to say, is there a way that you can find a shared dialogue space with people who are, quote, really designers? Eduardo, a redefinition of what design is in the first place. You're absolutely right. And so what is design? Well, you could say, looking back to Tony Fry's concept that design is an act of futuring, any act which is an act of futuring is an act of design. What does an act of futuring mean? Does it mean you took in a very controlled way project a future? We use this in our syllabus, the concept of design. Maybe I'll just read this passage from the syllabus because it's a passage which I think is useful here. Underneath outcomes, we said, design is often an act of force, command, and control. Arche. Designers and/or their methodologies choose what energies to harness, redirect, freeze, unchain. Critical design might approach this problem by asking what agency and potentia is afforded, and to whom or what system, modeling every artifact and system as agents in a broad network of affect, which takes power to construct and maintain, offering the design solution as a pharmacon, both poison and cure. This approach balances a stubborn optimism of will and action against the question, que fare? And so that's a kind of prepackaged, facile answer, I think, Felipe, to the point that you're bringing up. But one, doing philosophy is, of course, an act of design. So if Reza is saying that, then I'm totally on board. The question then becomes for you, what systems are you mapping, apprehending, and how are you rechanneling them so that the potentia, the power to affect and be affected, is restructured? And that's an act of design. You can think that through. I'm pretty sure if you're in Reza's program, you can think that through on a much deeper level than I can, because you have a lot of background there and horsepower. And presumably you're coming from a training in philosophy, so you're much more versed than I am. But I guess the other thing that I would say here would be that you look for ways that you can, and I started to say this a moment ago, you look for ways that you can create a productive dialogue with people who are, quote, grounded in design training, a disciplinary specific training, and you find a kind of common set of points of overlap for that discussion. So you could, if you work in a team structure, you could bring part of your disciplinary specialities to the teamwork, as it were, while opening yourself to their disciplinary specialities, but knowing that you will, with force, transfer some of your disciplinary virtuosity and skill sets to the other people on the team. It's the old idea that teaching is an act of violence. We made it a little nicer when we said design is an act of force, but it is an act of violence. The assertion of anything is a kind of a transmission. And to be honest, that's one reason why I'm so invested in the concept of gesture, because maybe there's a vagueness or an imprecision in the gesture, but there's also a gentleness, an invitation, as opposed to a domination. And I tend to be interested in that idea of invitation. asking the other in the McLuhan-esque sense to lean forward a bit. So maybe this is a roundabout way of approaching the point that you've brought up. Hopefully that works a bit. So Carl brings up this point about the world and what a world is question, and maybe Felipe, there's a way of linking this back to the point that you're making, in the sense that, I remember an interview with Tarkovsky where he implied pretty clearly that his films were universes unto themselves. They literally were universes. And there's a very funny moment in Alain Badiou's book on Deleuze, The Clamor of Being. I don't like Badiou, so I just have to put that as a caveat in advance, that you all understand I'm biased pretty strongly. That book pissed me off so much I threw it across the room multiple times. And I never quite finished it. I kept going back to the beginning and restarting it, and then reaching a point where my mind burst from fury and I just hurled it across the room. But anyway, I got partway through it, yes. And there's a point where he makes this really interesting argument about Deleuze being a kind of a royal philosopher, a philosopher of monovosity. And I think a lot of Deleuzians would throw the book across the room at that point immediately, but I was really intrigued by that. And the argument that he made, as I extrapolated it, was this really beautiful moment where he basically was paying a kind of a backhanded compliment to Deleuze by saying that there's this thing in Deleuze where Deleuze is basically, it's almost a flat ontology where it's an ontology of ultimate compassion and care. Everything in the ontology is equivalent, not in terms of the affect and power to affect and power to be affected, but in terms of the care that it gives and should be given. It's really interesting, and I know I'm totally paraphrasing this. I'm not even giving you a paraphrase. I'm just like translating through my memory this passage from Badiou. But it really was a beautiful moment where essentially everything is equivalent in terms of it's kind of like the honor that we should treat everything with that, and compassion that everything should have. Okay, so let's loop back to Tarkovsky. If every film is a universe, autonomous, then, as Carl points out, the world and what a world is question, seeming central, becomes crucial here, because at any scale, any abstract or logical construct, mathematical construct, philosophical argument is a world unto itself. And so in that sense, if the project is a making of and an unmaking of and a remaking of worlds, then clearly what you do as a philosopher is a design project in a very interesting way. And so maybe I'm already speaking too much because I've gone way beyond what you were interested in, or I'm starting to put words in your mouth. But that's something that I would say. So the question of how we embed ourselves in each other's practice becomes interesting. The instrument, I have tons of lectures on the notion of instrumentality and the apparatus coming out of film. Antonioni's blow up is fantastic and analyzed to death example. But in the context of blow up, if you pair it up with Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express and Fallen Angels, or you pair it up with The Invention of Morel by Bioy Casares, the short novel, which was adapted by Renee into Last Year at Marienbad. And then you ask yourself, what does it mean for an agent, nominally independent and autonomous, to discover that they are either embedded in a system or can become embedded in a system through the operation of an apparatus? Then maybe that's another really oblique way of addressing the point, I think, Felipe, that you're bringing up. And I've spoken too much. I see people dropping comments in here, and we should really. I invite other people to join in here. Zenobio, you have a boom, boom, boom exclamation points.
Yeah. It was to in the comments about this quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the word in various ways. The point is to change it. And I related this to the Bernal point of view about the function of art to be the creation of the universe instead of the representation. And yeah, there's this also art, science, and design, and also philosophy tends to be the boundaries tends to blur, right?
Yeah, and Carl, you know, the point that you're making about claiming the discipline isn't one of world making, that's it. That's an interesting one. You know, maybe people who are comfortable working across disciplines would be comfortable saying that regardless of whether they're filmmakers, composers, artists, bridge builders, you know, genetic engineers, if they're comfortable working across disciplines, they'd be comfortable imagining that they're actually involved in a world-making project. But maybe people who are really siloed in their disciplines would not be so free in thinking that their project is a disciplinary, is an open disciplinary project, which is a world-making project. You know, and I haven't spoken with Mo about this yet, actually, but in relationship to unmaking of worlds and unmaking of world project, what would it mean to be involved in the unmaking of a world project? And certainly, if we see injustice in the world, then we're all probably our primary response is to want to unmake the world that we see the injustice in, before we even think about making a new world. So I feel like there might be, in relationship to potentia and force, there might be another observation to be made there about what it means to position oneself as an agent with force who's responding to a force. I think of Desserteau here and his idea of his use of menace and cunning and the coup and the concept of theft to steal from an unjust system to remake the system in a different way. Yeah. Oh, interesting, Felipe. You're talking about Dune falling into malpractice. Yeah, we haven't spoken about Dune. I'm not sure if people had the opportunity because we sent that text out pretty late. If they had the opportunity to read it, but certainly, I mean, if you look even at just the very first book in the Dune series, there's a ton, you know, a metric shit ton of malpractice going on there. So the next question would be, as you fan out across the sequels, which I read decades ago, really. I mean, I read the second and the third and the fourth book in the Dune series when I was really young, and I never went back to them. I always then just stuck with the first book because it served the function for me in terms of what I needed to do in thinking general ecologies. There's an awful lot of malpractice, certainly, and then one would rightly ask, in the Dune universe, well, it isn't just about terraforming Dune. The Fremen aren't just people who want a green planet. You know, they don't just want their planet to be green. And Jessica and Paul clearly see the bigger picture. Jessica, because of her Bene Gesserit training and her kind of macro historical worldview, and the fact that she has thousands of Reverend Mothers living inside her head. Paul, because he sees across, you know, the macro historical framework and understands that it's going to be jihad no matter what across the galaxy. And so both of those are able to apprehend the kind of dangerous consequences of what happens if Paul succeeds in becoming, you know, who he becomes. And if Dune is partly greened, right? So I think that's an important point to make there. Yeah. I really want to stop talking so much. I'm trying to keep track of everybody's points in the chat and respond to them, but also I think there's a question around artificiality. Oh, yeah.
Do you mind if I ask a bit of a longer question than just then like a
Will,
sentence in chat?
please. Yeah, please, Will. Hey, nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. Nice to see you.
Nice to meet everybody, but Will, because we had an exchange, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think I guess I've been spending time recently, like very much in reading and thinking in like about the political, and I think that I think this is not I think many have made this critique. I don't know how legible it is or how much cross discussion it is around the sort of practice community, and I'm thinking particularly around Ben Bratton because he has he's struck obviously has so much sway, at least from my sort of low position. And I think that there's a certain, like, if you approach it from a purely political, like resolutely political position, which many do, like there is a figure of liberalism in the notion of design and the sort of investment of design in potentia in its incipient form, as opposed to maybe something like its excipient form. And that is troubling. And at its worst, like there's this quote from Hortense Spillers describing the white easement on the black body. And that of course should be troubling for us. And I wonder about this the notion of world making and these post-planetary design and the sort of like the move to sort of value design, or to create design that values itself as such, or something like that.
Yeah.
Or to engage in design that values itself as such. I wonder about that. That is not so sort of, at least as I can think of it, like that's so compelled towards like a form of like gesture that is inescapably historically, structurally confined. And I think again, and that's not to say, and that's to question the idea that the gesture can like escape historical and structural confinement.
Well, it's there are a bunch of points there, and I'm going to just try to intuitively take those on. I had a lot of conversations over the years with Ben about his work, and he was generous enough to have conversations about my work. We had a consortium going back around 2011, 12, 13, did a bunch of conferences together, and had known each other since a decade before that. And so I've always been, kind of in awe of his unbelievable fluidity of thinking and his ability to build these giant aegis umbrellas over disciplines and find connections for them. Really wonderful person. And there's an interesting inhumanism in maybe this is a Gestalt take on how he sees design, or the role of design. And I do remember that when Reza wrote the Labor of the Inhuman text a few years ago, either I was having a conversation with Benjamin, or he emailed me saying that I needed to read it. And so this is a really like oblique way of approaching the point that you're saying about who should be premiated in given the privilege of deciding what a future is. In a way that's kind of what world making is. And there would be a lot of different ways of answering that. One would be to be brutal and simply say, well, the universe has already decided a set of rules, and it's already built billions of worlds. I don't mean planets, but I mean just on our own world, there are billions of worlds at different scales. And so what we have to do is understand what we've been given. This is where Desserteau's thinking was really helpful for me, because it's about understanding what the given is and understanding that perhaps memory and time working together can leverage in the cycle to enact a coup upon the given and remake the given. That's exactly what the kind of trick in practice of everyday life, that the central trick and coup and punchline, to use his own terminology in terms of storytelling and jokes, is that one learns to recognize what the frame of the given is, and then one learns to make a decision about what the coup should be in terms of reframing the given.
I was thinking about Kenya Hara's X-formation, so a design practice that would make something unknown as opposed to known. And I think that's like an interesting way to escape like this kind of, I don't know, maybe trap of like that design or world making can like become a constrainment or something like something, a cycle that repeats itself historically on a way that's addicted. And I think, yeah, that's like this, like design is all over and like worlds are all over, but we can have like methods that are like constructs different alternatives. So like politically speaking.
Yeah, Malo, it's interesting you bring that point up, because I had an exchange with David Roden just a couple of days ago where we were talking about cosmopolitics, and I wanted him to participate. I hope he'll participate in the cosmopolitics event this fall. I'm going to do everything I can to convince him to do that. But he said something interesting about feeling that his vision of what possible cosmopolitics are is often a bit dark. And I think that there's an interesting transition from your point about what the unknown is to make something unknown, or the kind of structuralist premise, strani, sorry, terrible accent on my part, but the making strange of something as a deliberate act of ethical design. One frames the concept of ethics by saying something like, do the least harm and open the most possibilities. And doing the least harm and opening the most possibilities in a human design framework is potentially a making strange, so that people then lean forward. They lean back and then they lean forward because they have to understand what's going on. But if you extrapolate the making strange out to like a really broad framework, then it can become, literally like an event horizon level hell from outer space kind of situation, where bodies are made strange across each other in a nightmarish dream space, literally hellscape. And the making strange, and this is the scenario that I think many people see coming out of the singularity, the rapture of the geeks. Will it happen? Will it not happen? Some people think, well, if it really happens, then what artificial superintelligence will want will be so alien to us, so strange, so unfamiliar, that not only is there no way we can understand what it might be, but there's no way we can ever maintain ourselves as humans in the face of it. And I think I've used the argument that in terms of an orthogonal cosmopolitics, actually Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy is a neutral orthogonal cosmopolitics. It's not a destructive cosmopolitics. Even though, the image from Annihilation shows the person being blown apart by a giant fungus, even though some of the women die as they explore the shimmer space, both in the film and in the book, it seems to me that it's a neutral orthogonal cosmopolitics in the sense that the alien system is preserving fragments of the human and extrapolating and exfoliating through this speciation process. And I actually would link that back to Ben's notions of design, Benjamin Bratton's notions of design. I think Ben sees that act of strangeness as much as he can from a non-anthropocentric perspective. Again, Malu, Will, I think those points that you're bringing up are very connected. I think Benjamin is pretty comfortable with there not being much human left. It's funny, Ben used precisely the term to evacuate the human diagram. years ago, I remember either in a lecture that he gave or a conversation, he used that term, and I think he even in the very beginning meant it as a double entendre. It is both to evacuate most of what we consider to be human from the human diagram. It's like open the pod bay doors, Hal, blow most of the human diagram out into space, and then close the pod bay doors and keep what, this little bit of human left. But it's also to evacuate the human diagram. It's like an evacuation plan. Put a frame around the human diagram and evacuate it, send it somewhere. Get it, project it to the future, encapsulate the bits and the parts that are still strange, but still worth saving somehow, and evacuate them to some other location in space and time. So I feel like, again, to connect back to Will's point, there's something in Benjamin's work that's very much tuned into the conversation that we're having. I guess, Malo, it would be up to you as a designer or an artist or a maker to decide which parts of the world or the universe you wanted to make strange, and then maybe part of the argument for doing that would be to lay out what the effects would be on the inhabitants or the user base or the people who are stuck in that universe, in that world.
May I jump in?
Please, yeah.
Thanks. This made me think about two not very separate references. One is a sentence by Ray Brassier, in which he defines the human not as an essence but as an activity. And this for me, this complicates a lot of preoccupations with defining the human and the alien, because in Brassier's view, the human is now something which can define itself. And the other reference was Greg Egan's orthogonal trilogy. Have you read it? Where due to a lot of complicated physics in this other world, a species who is on the verge of impending doom due to some objects which will collide with their planet, they have to travel into outer space, but due to this very different physics, traveling to outer space for them means traveling out of time. So during this trip, which for them lasts 5 generations or something like that, a lot, their activity as a species changes a lot because there are a lot of biological constraints which they have to surpass. They make new legislation, they develop new agricultural techniques and new physics models, and then come back to something like 1 day later to their own planet with a lot more knowledge. And this kind of orthogonal thinking or orthogonal activity can define a species. I think this could inform a lot of what we seem to be calling a design project.
That's really interesting. I've read some of Egan's other work. I've read Schild's Ladder a number of times and Permutation City. And I guess Schild's Ladder is one of my favorites. And Carla also has read Schild's Ladder and really likes it. The point that you're making about becoming strange to one's own civilization is a point for me that I guess it can be leveraged across a range of different timescales, because clearly if we try to reinvent ourselves as individuals in this moment or in the very near future, we're making ourselves strange to ourselves in what we consider at the moment to be a kind of a productive way. And there's a moment in Schild's Ladder where a child, they're not really children because they're kind of like young humans who are running on quantum computers, asks their parent how they can know who they are and how they should develop, and the parent gives them an answer about assessing the now and building conceptual model of projecting out into the future, and just always keeping that conceptual model at hand. It's almost as if the conceptual model is more important as the sense of self than the sense of self is to use the conceptual model to know where one should go. And I think that that's also related perhaps in a way to the concept of extinction that just came up in the thread. It becomes a question of how systems should persist, either individual systems, organisms, or civilizations. You know, this is why Cixin Liu's work in Three Body Problem, Dark Forest, Death's End trilogy has been really important for me, because the axiom of the cosmological sociology that Wenjin Ye gives to Luo Zhu, the very first one is that civilizations want to survive and that resources are scarce. And that sets up the problem for a cosmic sociology, a cosmologically scaled sociology, which ultimately is related to extinction. Of course, it could be that an individual or a culture or a civilization or an alien civilization would be comfortable with the idea of extinction. I mean, the point that someone made just now, Carl, I think, made it, extinction is a problem only from a naive conception of value on a very long time scale. That's an interesting point, because one could look at the shaker culture, human shaker culture, a decision to not reproduce organismically, but a culture can reproduce itself. Like a culture can be a framework for action that other people adopt, and then decide not to have children, but still get together with a larger group of people to build a town, a city, a village, a way of living, knowing that they will all go extinct. In that concept, you know, the town layout for the Shaker village is linear and ends with the cemetery at the end of the town plan. And the Shakers have chosen not to reproduce. So if they don't reproduce, then after one generation, their village is empty. So what's the framework? I don't know enough about Shaker culture and philosophy, actually, to know if they have taken into account that idea and that a certain percentage of them will always, by necessity, just end up reproducing. So there will always be more Shaker people, or if they just assume that humanity will, at a certain point, if everyone becomes a Shaker, humanity will simply go extinct. And that's okay. And so I think these are questions that also end up getting folded back into the kind of framework of design and force, command and control that we try to articulate in that point in the syllabus. How do we all position ourselves individually and collectively as agents with force? And how do we imagine with force defining a future? Of course, you know, you bring up the Greg Egan and how they have to navigate a different form of time, and there's also a very different form of time, space in Schild's ladder as well that Egan takes on in an extremely kind of provocative, clever way. And ultimately, at the end of Schild's ladder, it kind of breaks down because we live in a human frame of time and a human space-time. He has to use the kind of armature of human perception of space-time to describe a very non-human universe, space-time, and translate it back into how we read a novel and think about space-time. But anyway, the point I'm making here is we're faced with the problem of defining for ourselves what an appropriate active force is, both in relationship to the world around us, to define a world or to drop an artifact into the world, which will then assert itself as it goes off doing what it does in the world, or exerting force upon ourselves to change the way that we are in the world. And for me, and I won't speak for Carla, but maybe for Carla, but for me, that's the core of the question with the bait and switch of planetary, post-planetary design. You know, you heard post-planetary design and it was interesting, intriguing, provocative. You came maybe for post-planetary design to discover that it wasn't really about post-planetary design at all. But that it was partly about post-planetary design, but that it was about morals and ethics in universalist thinking. And that's where those things connect to the post-planetary design framework. It's a provocation. It really is a provocation. I think we're almost out of time, but jump in with more thoughts, folks.
There's some interesting things in the chat, but it goes in different strands.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's nice to just jump in and we can have the discussion.
Hey, I've had this thought going around in my head since Philippe spoke about the role of philosophy in design. And I'm thinking particularly about this thing called the Dikenga, which is a cosmogram, basically, with like 4 cardinal points, and how that exists as a model of life, right, in African philosophy or Bantu Congo cosmogonies. So it exists as a model of life and the life cycle, right? And it also translates into a philosophy, but also translates into a design language. And you could see that through how rondavels are designed, right? So you have kraals, right? And then you think about like fractalisms and how kraals are designed as fractals, right? So it's sort of like the outer part of the village consists of rondavels that are for normal individuals who are part of the community. And inside that circle of sort of rondavels, there's another circle, you know, according to the hierarchy. And then at the center of the kraal, you find the rondavel where the chief lives, right? And then in the center of the chief's rondavel, you find a small sort of rondavel, like a really tiny one, size of a pot, that's for the spirits that sort of take care of the space. So I'm just thinking about how, you know, like symbolism or models for life in African philosophy translate into design languages for spaces, which I find like incredibly fascinating. I mean, you find African fractal designs way before Mandelbrot comes up with the Mandelbrot set, you know, and it's always been a mystery. Like, how did these people come up with this design language that's incredibly efficient in terms of thinking about fortifying a space, you know, sort of like the chief is at the center. That's the person who needs to protect the most because they continue the lineage of our space and they're carriers of knowledge, you know, like when you think about how griots, right? Griots are the carriers of sort of oral language and oral histories. And those are the people we need to protect within the village, you know? So think about how cosmogonies and the illustration of cosmogonies through something like the Dikenga cosmogram translates into a design language, right? That people can actually use that's functional. So, you know, when I think about post-planetary, my whole argument, even within the work that I do, has always been, especially with the decolonial discourse happening locally in South Africa, has always been, why do we want to come up with new sort of ideas, right? When we already have philosophies and ways of being and becoming that have been established and were raised or pushed to the peripheral by colonialism, right? Why do we want to come up with new methodologies when we already have methodologies that exist that we could apply to our cities, you know, especially like thinking about Joburg and Joburg being like one of like the only cities in the world with apartheid spatial planning. And the effect of that, you know, still continues today because you can't dismantle the city. We still need to live here, you know, but because that space is designed that way, the effect that it has on your body and your lived experience is insane. You know, it's sort of like, it makes it dangerous. Even how people think about Johannesburg globally, they think about it as a dangerous city. And I think I can't attribute that to the people here. I can attribute it to the design of the space, you know? And I think if we design cities based like here, and I'm speaking about locality now, if in my locale, I believe that if we design cities using that kind of philosophy that we push to the peripheral, something different would happen. Yeah, that's just what I've been thinking about as we're talking about.
That's a really, really crucial set of points. One thing that makes me think about is the concept of a pattern language that as architects and urbanists we could identify, and this goes back to the 60s and the 70s work on pattern languages, and they would be kind of cross-culturally universal ways of creating enclosed spaces, public spaces, spaces for specific public programs, public gatherings, performances, theaters, schools, private spaces, bedrooms, backyards, gardens. There's an entire, in the pattern language work, an entire taxonomy of those spaces, arguably cross-culturally because of the reference work that they did looking cross-culturally at planetary design, many human cultures designs. And so there's an interesting argument that you get out of that, which is almost a positivist argument, which is like, okay, well, we looked at all of the cultures on our planet and we found the shared features of design that they have, and we found the design parameters that were the ones that everybody liked the most. We all felt really good in those spaces. And then we kind of synthesized them, and we came up with a way of just with these very small, this very small list of taxonomies, a way of making good public space, of good private space, of good urban space, of good township. And that, that had an interesting impact in some science fiction that I remember reading back in the 70s. John Brunner's Shockwave Rider, which is a really important book for me, ends with a town which is constructed very much along the lines of a kind of a pattern language set of rule sets. And the characters, when they first arrive at this town, they're like, this is a perfect town. Why does it all feel so good? Nick's like, it feels so good. This is like amazing. And it's clear that Brunner was paying attention to that concept. So it's a really interesting hypothesis for me that we could identify architectural and urban typologies that would just be good for us. And the flip side of that is the point that you just made, which is basically like, well, if we designed a city to be evil, to be divisive, to be carceral, what would it feel like to live in that city when it is a kind of a divided city? And then what would it feel like to live in that city after some of that divisiveness was removed from a legal and a cultural and a social standpoint, but nonetheless, the city remains as an artifact, which we have to face every day. And that's a really, really interesting point, because to me, that then starts to ask the question, well, where does form do something because we believe it does something? This goes back to people like Bernard Tschumi, right? And where does form do something because it actually does something to us? So like you can make the argument, a chain has been put on my arm, I cannot move, is different than someone told me to stay here, I cannot move, versus this used to be a prison, but now it's turned into a school. I'm like riffing on the Foucauldian notion of institutional structure, and so I can't move. Where's the force? It's a really, really interesting question in relationship to where the force is. And actually, this might be an interesting reference for some of you. It might be an interesting reference for you too. There's a science fiction novel by Yoon-Ha Lee called Nine Fox Gambit. And some of you have probably read this. I've read it a couple of times. It's a really provocative book. I think I read it like in the past few years, a number of books I've read because of Stephen Shaviro's, recommendation of it. Stephen's he reads everything, and he has fantastic analysis and commentary on everything that he reads. But in any case, one of the most interesting concepts in Nine Fox Gambit, it's a kind of a space opera. There's an enormous amount of combat. Main character is a soldier, and she's promoted to be a kind of a standing general on a campaign in space battle, yeah. And she's sent to subdue a rebellion. The rebellion is a culture. It's actually an alliance of cultures that are practicing what's called calendrical heresy. They follow a different calendar. Now, you'd say, well, okay, so what's the big deal about them following a different calendar? Well, the way that calendrical heresy works in this world, in this universe that Yoon-Ha Lee describes, they actually can build weapons that kind of work like magic weapons. And they do things in space-time. If you go into a space where it's ruled by a different calendrical system, your own weapons don't work because your spells, literally your space-time and physics and math governed spells no longer work. And her soldiers, when they go into battle, she has to be sure that they've all been trained in the same calendrical forms so that they all form swarms together coherently. And if they go into a zone which is controlled by the people that they're fighting, where the calendrical forms have been replaced or altered or damaged, her soldiers' formations won't work. They'll have to adopt different tactics and strategies. And it's a really fascinating thing because the first time I read the book, I actually was thinking like, oh, wow, well, this is a kind of a space opera that it's just talking about magic. And then I read it very carefully again, and I thought, well, actually, maybe what they're talking about is they're talking about people with such, as Arthur C. Clarke says, such an advanced technology that the writer is writing about it as if it's magic, but it actually, quote, works. So people who believe in one calendrical structure actually alter the structure of space-time and the performance of tools in space-time for other people who believe in a different calendrical structure, but who enter this zone of calendrical heresy. And it's a fascinating, fascinating novel for me, reading it that way. And it takes on exactly the points that you're raising about what does it mean when a culture has a belief structure. I was using the Shaker example, you're using the similarity between the cosmogram and the way that spatial layouts perform. And this is very interesting because this is where, of course, we would have to go deeply into it and say, well, where is there a kind of a placebo effect? I believe it works. You believe it works. Therefore, it works. And
Yeah,
so
I'm thinking about even consensual attribution, right? Like the sort of like when we attribute power to something, that's when it has power. And when we don't agree that something has power, then it doesn't have power. And thinking back to what you were speaking about, like about calendrical spaces, what actually happened, I have a friend, so I'm a spiritual practitioner and he's also a spiritual practitioner, but much older than me. And he speaks about how in the 1940s, when through apartheid spatial planning, we started building yards in a square format, right? So we had yards in a square format, and that meant we can't build rondavels because they take up much more space. And what started happening with that was that a lot of sangomas and sangomas are basically spiritual practitioners, people, divinatory kind of individuals. And they said that in when they started living in these square houses, they couldn't dream anymore. They couldn't communicate with their ancestors anymore. And they had to go and speak to their ancestors, you know, by the river and be like, yo, like, what is happening right now? Like, why can't we dream anymore? And they were like, it's because you've changed the shape of your space. You know, thinking about even things like Feng Shui and the movement of energy, thinking about force, right? How energy moves in a space, how energy is directed in a space, you know? So thinking about architecture and how architecture can become like a sort of repository for like the movement of forces and even a portal that connects the visible and the invisible, you know, thinking about how my grandma used to, like, the reason I asked her, I was like, she lived in a roundabout. And I was like, why do you live in this round house? And she was like, it's because, you know, I don't live in the township. I live near the bush. And if a snake comes in here and my house is square, it's gonna make a home of this place. But if the house is round, it's just gonna go out, around, and out the door again. You know, so I've been thinking about things like that, like very, yeah.
wow.
You know, like these ideas around like how, you know, we have an architecture, you know, like, but are we applying it? You know, like those are the questions that I'm asking, you know, in my own practice. So thank you for sharing that reference.
Thank you,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
That reminds me of a funny story which Carla would love would love it if I told you folks. Speaking of snakes coming into the house I grew up in was built in a forest by my parents in the late 1950s. It's a stone house, and they changed it in the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s, and they built a central heating system onto it. And when they put the central heating system in, they put ducts into the house. And the ducts couldn't go through the stone part, so they put a duct leading up to the stone part, and that's where it stopped. And then they kept using like a fireplace in the old part of the stone house, and the newer part, they had all the duct work going. Okay, so in 2003, Carla and I moved back into the house. We were living there in 2003. We lived there for a number of years. Then we discovered that not only in the ductwork, but in the stone walls of the old house, there actually are snakes living. And they were corn snakes and garter snakes, so they were totally non-poisonous. They're eating the mice in the walls, of course, and they found a really great space to live in the house. But they did crawl through the ducts and fall into the furnace. And there was one point where when they moved in many ways, right? There was one point where we had to have the furnace work done, and the man who came to work on the furnace, we opened up the side of the furnace. Carla was with him, and she looked in and she said, "There are snakes in here." And the guy was like, "I don't do snakes. I fix furnaces. I'm not getting in there to fix your furnace. Like, this is not my job description." And so we had to clean the snakes out of the furnace for real. And some of them were dead. It was a mess. And at other points when people came to visit us, we told them this story, and this is the punchline of the story. The most beautiful part, our dear friend Carla Rothstein came with her husband and her child, Sky, and Sky was maybe only 8 or 9 years old at the time. And we told Sky this story, and Sky was like, "Oh, we brought snakes home from school. We had snakes as pets. This was great." The morning that Sky and her family were leaving, we stopped by the duct in the kitchen, and at that exact moment, a snake crawled out of the duct. And we were able to catch the snake, and Sky saw that the story was true. There were snakes living not only in our ducts, but in our walls in the house. And so this question of cohabitation and infrastructure and how the system is designed and who's responsible for the system and what their job description is. You know, the guy was horrified when we opened up the panel on the furnace and looked in, and it's like, "There are snakes in our furnace." He was like, "No, that's not my job description. I'm hired to service furnaces, not get snakes out of them." So I feel like this is all very much a part of the way that there's this kind of productive overlap between systems, cracks between systems where one system bleeds into the other. You know, and in that case, my parents didn't build the stone house to have snakes living in the walls, but they would have been happy if they'd known it happened. The man was not happy with snakes living in the furnace ducts. His law and his job and his economy didn't handle that. There was no connection there, zero connection. No, you folks, you take the snakes out of the furnace. I'll fix the heat exchanger in the furnace. And so I feel like that's very much part of the discussion we're having, like finding these different scales of ecology, and then trying to figure out how they actually intersect directly with form, and then making decisions about which forms we want to preserve. And then it's a really interesting dialogue that I see us having with ourselves about trying to figure out which forms are actually healthy. I mean, you have to invoke the term healthy in relationship to this. And people have been talking about extinction in the thread. I haven't taken that up too much, and energy flow and so forth. And so there's a whole range of really, really interesting conversations here to have about precision in terms of how something functions and actually functions. And again, you know, if you and I have a shared belief about how something functions, and we spend time with whatever that thing is, whether it's a space or an artifact or a technology or a cultural structure, then it's going to function that way. And this goes back to modernism and high modernism and different design practitioners' approaches to modernism. If you want to invoke Corbusier and colonialist force in Corbusier, or if you want to look at Toomey and imagine Toomey either as a kind of a weird extrapolation of colonialist force through transprogramming and disprogramming, or maybe take an optimistic view of Toomey and say Toomey's actually like a totally non-modernist in the sense that transprogramming and disprogramming is a way of a reinvention of self, totally cross-culturally. There's so many fascinating discussions to be had around architecture and urban design and form design in relationship to the point that you're bringing up. Yeah, thank you so much. That's really, really interesting.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I don't know, how much time do we have? Are we out of time, Artemis?
Yeah, already 10 minutes
Okay,
after.
okay.
But
Okay.
I asked, for that reason, I asked if there is another seminar just after us, and there is one in 1.5 hours. So
Oh,
if
okay,
we want to
okay.
wrap up now, it's fine. But also if we want to look at some of the comments, because some of them are really interesting like questions in the chat. But as you wish, like.
Yeah, I missed Will having to sign off, but yeah, there was something that someone wrote about what extinction is. Eduardo and Carl were talking about this, and Tegan, situated knowledges, discussion around gesture and duration. Maybe around extinction, you know, there's a quote that I always use from Kojève in talks like this about the end of the human, you know, and what it means for the human to be situated at the end of history. And I'll paraphrase, but Kojève says something to the lines of, it's not a tragedy at the end of history when the human is no longer human, something continues. And that's perfectly fine, that something continues, even if it's not human at all. And for me, you know, I feel that this is a place where we would want to step back in. Eduardo, maybe you can chime in here on this, but this would be a place where, if you're still here, where we would make a decision about what aspects of being human we want to continue, if we have the ability to do that. Obviously, if a planet-killing asteroid hits our planet, then we won't have any choice at all, and the universe will continue, and we will cease. But Eduardo, I wonder if you want to jump in there if you're still here. Maybe I meant.
Well, yeah, I'm here, but I think it was like enough with that. Like, yeah, like, you know, this is only my opinion, but nowadays we see like a lot of kind of prefixes around the word human and also in other words. For me, I feel like it's much more operative to think about the human itself as something that is dynamic, instead of thinking that we are we are continuing doing steps in being something else, which is still human. You know what I mean? Instead of thinking that we are going to become at some point post-human, there's going to be like a big jump between the human and the post. But actually, we are like very, very different than how we were when we didn't have like iPhones, for example. You know, like the way in which we operate. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's also related to the idea of extinction. You know, like
yes.
We are. Extinction is, I mean, you know, it could happen the way in which Thomas framed it, like the completely deleting of what we conceive as human, but also somehow we are going extinct like in every moment, you know, and becoming something. If the human has something that is not dynamic, is going to be extinct like every day, you know, because actually we are changing all the time.
Yeah, you know, there's a very beautiful text by Stephen Wolfram that I've read a few times recently, and I'll send the link to everybody. The title is Showing Off to the Universe, Beacons for the Afterlife of Our Civilization. Actually, I'll drop the link in the text in the chat. And you know, Wolfram is a renowned mathematician who developed the Wolfram language and a new kind of science and Mathematica. He's also a pretty cross-disciplinary thinker. He consulted on the film Arrival, and in a couple of interesting ways. And his kid also helped consult on software design and language design for the film Arrival. And he's posted a couple of really interesting blog posts on that. But this particular link that I just dropped in has to do with the idea of the funeral pyre beacon. So in cosmological sense, if our civilization was about to go extinct and we still had enough time and energy to do it, we could put together a funeral pyre beacon, which could be some satellites orbiting our planet, or maybe a mausoleum on the moon or on Pluto, which would be an artifact there for future alien civilizations to discover, to know what we had been. And Wolfram writes this very long text, basically saying like, well, this is connected to the problem of communication with aliens. Like, how do we know that they'll be able to understand anything that we left behind? How will they be able to translate it? What would it mean to build something that will last for that long? what would be of interest to an alien civilization? And this is the most important part of this particular text for me. I mean, everyone will pull something else out of it. But he basically, Wolfram sees the world through his own frameworks, through his own version of sub-mathematical computational performance, which he develops in a whole taxonomy of cellular automata in his world, in his system. He sees it through what he calls the principle of computational equivalence. So basically, when Wolfram looks at the world, he looks at something and he's like, what kind of computational system is that? That lamp that's lighting my face so that you folks can see me a little bit better. This silver and gold ring on my finger, what kind of computation does it do? What are all of the timescales and material systems and cultural systems that it computes through? And is there something in this room which is computationally equivalent to this ring? Well, Carla's ring on her finger is kind of computationally equivalent, but maybe there's an artifact in this room that Carla and I both hold dear that's roughly computationally equivalent to the ring in terms of how much it weighs as a metal, but also because we imbued it with a certain kind of meaning. Okay, so an alien would look at everything humans have done if they subscribe to Wolfram's notion of computational equivalence, and they'd be like, whoa, that's very similar to what we do. In fact, that's no different than what we do. So what's of interest here? Not much. There's not much here. And so Wolfram makes this argument, you'll read it, but he makes this argument in this text that we shouldn't try to show off to the aliens and be like, here's the technology we came up with. Because not only will the aliens potentially have come up with something that's computationally equivalent, but nature itself has also. Nature itself has made things that are computationally equivalent to our laptops. Whether it's in the magnetohydrodynamic performance inside the sun at a molecular and submolecular level, which is computing like goodness knows how much, or in the leaf of a tree doing photosynthesis at a level which is actually quantum. Yeah. So the aliens won't look at that and say, this is really interesting. They'll look at it and they'll be like, yeah, we've seen this all over the place. This isn't interesting. And so ultimately the conclusion Wolfram comes to is it's literally the minutia of the form of life, to rip this idea off from Agamben, which Wolfram doesn't, but I do. It's the minutia of our lived experience that would be of interest to an alien civilization. It's literally just what it's like for me to drink the last drop of coffee and taste that coffee. That would be interesting to an alien if it's computationally non-reducible. Then again, if me tasting the coffee is computationally reducible and equivalent to something for the alien, then maybe they won't be interested in it. So Wolfram has got a pretty rigid framework for parsing the world around him in that sense, we could say. But I found it moving and liberating in the sense that maybe the only thing that really is worth saving is just the experience of being. And maybe that's the only thing that's worth communicating. And that's a gesture, potentially. Or we can argue about this, but maybe that's a gesture. And so for me, this does tie back to the question of extinction as well and what it means to define the human. It provides a very interesting framework for what it would mean to define something unique or something worth saving. And I, in my mind, it ties back to the funeral pyre beacon. It ties back to cosmopolitical design, cosmologically scaled thinking frameworks, Dyson's work, etc. It ties all of those things together in a really, really interesting way. The point that you bring up, though, in terms of what it means to define the human and the limits of the human is very, very important also. And each of us might have a very different approach and a different kind of argument to make about what the human is and what the limits of the human, might be. So, yeah, someone pointed out Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis and Ian Bogost's Alien Phenomenology. Yeah. I don't know, maybe that's a good place to stop to meditate on what the boundaries of the human are in the face of extinction. What we choose to save, what we choose to value. We can be the philosopher hanging by a twig on the side of the cliff with the tiger below, and I don't know, the angry army above and the strawberry right in front of us. Let's taste the strawberry before we fall. Okay, Artemis, you have a way of archiving the chat, is that correct? I don't hear you. Unmute, unmute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, the chat is saved, and then it will be uploaded in the classroom after
Okay,
the
cool.
recording is available.
Okay, cool. So everybody, thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for the
Thank you, Ed.
awesome discussion and the comments. And we will get back to you in terms of the question between Slack and Discord. The syllabus has all of the readings for the next couple of weeks. If there are films to be seen, we will make an attempt to drop those films into the Google Drive because we have copies of most of them. In the case of Arrival, I don't actually remember if we have a copy of it, but it's an easy film to see online. The only thing I would say is please do not share any of the stuff that goes into the Google Drive as a link to the outside world, because this is only for the purpose of our seminar. We have most of the texts either as PDFs or links. In fact, I think we have 100% of the text that we're assigning as either PDFs or links. So that'll be all in there. Some of them might be EPUBs, but you can easily find software that will allow you to read that stuff. And so the assignment for next week is pretty clear in there. And we will be joining you in discussion online over the next few days to talk about the work that you're doing. We're super enthusiastic and looking forward to the year. So thank you again so much for joining.
Super exciting.
Thanks. Bye.
All right.
Thank you. Bye, all.
See you soon. Ciao, ciao.